Okay, welcome back. We are pretty much at the end of attachment now already. How scary is that? So we've developed it through a variety of different stages. So we've looked at a couple of theories as to how attachment develops. We've looked at different attachment types, how that varies by different culture. And now we're looking at sort of the saddest part of attachment, I think. Two big questions for the next two lessons. What happens when you don't form an attachment? So what happens when there is absolutely no primary caregiver to develop a strong attachment with? That's next lesson. That's looking at institutionalization. That's looking at orphans. This lesson today is, again, Bowlby. Big old Bowlby. He's back to his up to his old tricks, looking at his theory of maternal deprivation. This comes up again in forensic psychology. Hopefully we'll be back so I can teach you in person maternal deprivation in crime. That'd be lovely. So it's quite a prominent theory and it's had quite a lot of research basis around it, but also a lot of criticisms. As you can imagine, with Bowlby, he's not necessarily the most prestigious psychologist because he is a little bit sexist. So this is quite an interesting viewpoint. So the big question around this is what happens when we have a separation from the mother or mother substitute? How does that impact on development socially, intellectually, forming relationships later on in life? So we'll look at his idea of maternal deprivation. We need to apply it to some scenarios and some other questions, and then have some supportive evidence, but also some evidence that goes against it to create a well-rounded approach. Oh, with a partner, wouldn't that be lovely? So just think to yourself, I've kind of given it away about maternal deprivation. What impact is this going to have? So Bowlby says that prolonged deprivation of a young child of maternal care specifically may have grave and far-reaching effects on his character, similar in form to deprivation of vitamins in infancy. So he's comparing the maternal love, the maternal bond, to vital vitamins that keep people alive, keep people going. And in essence, we can kind of understand that. If you don't have somebody who you connect with, you bond with, you value, that's going to have quite an important, blueprint on your future. You might think completely differently. So attachment disruption, we have separation. So when you are separated for a short period from your primary caregiver, who you already have an attachment, that's separation. Deprivation is when a bond that has been formed is broken. Okay, so there's a distinct between the two. This is also on page 88 of your textbook. So separation, the child not being in the presence of the primary attachment caregiver, whereas deprivation is being that bond is significantly broken. And it's quite difficult to distinguish between the two. So those two together equal a bond disruption. Now, we spoke about the critical period before, and it comes back in this section. So he's arguing that we have this critical period from about 6 months to 2 years where the infant should have continuous, unbroken relationship with one person. Like we looked at a couple lessons ago, that's called monotropy. So that distinct relationship with one primary caregiver is really important to any other development. So the first 30 months of life is this critical period where we need to have lots of care, lots of love, lots of attention so that no psychological damage takes place. You can already start to think of, hopefully, some evaluation of this, or what happens if you've got a working mum who potentially relies on daycare or nursery. Does that mean they're not going to create those bonds? Is that going to be disrupted? Are they not going to develop psychologically healthy? We used to look at the impact of daycare. It was really interesting. It's a shame they got rid of it. And how that impedes on relationship and potentially impacts in quite a significant way But really, if anything, I think daycare and nursery is probably helpful to a child. It makes them be more social. They have to go and interact with different individuals at different ages. I think it's probably quite a good thing. But Bowlby completely against it. So this is what we would call socially sensitive research. We'll look at that at the start of year 13. What that means is just thinking about the impact it's going to have on the people involved, the participants. So this is all focused again on mums and their maternal deprivation. So it is quite a complicated area of research, but also quite interesting. I'm not going to do that, we're going to do this. So the effects that it has on development then, again, all this on page 88. If you'd rather just make the notes from that, that's totally fine, or do it as you go. So two main factors that is affected through this maternal deprivation, which is intellectually. So Bowlby believed that we would observe mental retardation characterised by an abnormally low IQ. So if you have this severe deprivation, if you have this severe separation or maternal deprivation, intellectually, you're going to struggle. And a bit of research into this is Goldfarb, which is at the bottom of page 89, into a deprivation study. Lower IQ in children who remained in institutions or care homes, as opposed to those who were fostered and thus had a higher standard of emotional care. So one good thing that has come from maternal deprivation, and we'll look at this next lesson into institutionalisation, is how we now have care workers for children in care, which can have a massive impact on these two things. So, but back then there wasn't that. So he was arguing intellectually that IQ is going to be lower, they're going to be classified as mentally retarded, which means that they're not going to be able to progress in the future. Emotionally as well, so one thing we need to look at is something called affectionless psychopathy, which has now been changed in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. What has it been changed to? I can't remember, look it up. But he classed it as affectionless psychopathy, which basically means there's an inability to process guilt or have any strong emotions for others. They're quite hostile, really uncaring, not really loving, preventing them from developing normal relationships, as you can imagine. And he associated it with criminality. We've got one key bit of supporting evidence for this, which we'll look at in a minute, is the 44 Thieves study. But he's basically arguing that we have this link between affectionless psychopathy, which happens because of emotional development. If there isn't that maternal figure there, then they don't experience guilt, they're hostile, they can't process emotions, which he thinks links with criminality. Okay, so no mum creates this affectionless psychopath, which is because of maternal deprivation linked to crime. So a lot to be taken in there. This is the findings from the study. So have a look at that graph. And we've got 44 thieves, young individuals, young teenagers accused of stealing. So our thieves here, we've got a proportion of them that have affectionless psychopathy and a proportion that have early separation. So how are these going to link to deprivation theory? So if we've got the thieves have affectionless psychopathy and early separation, whereas our controls just have the early separation. So it's quite an interesting graph, an interesting study, until we delve down into it. So what I want you to do is pause this. Bottom of page 88, you've got Bowlby's 44 Thieves study, 5W it, write down the information, what happened, who was involved, what can we conclude, think of some AO3, I'm going to talk about that as well, because remember with any study, we need to be delving into the methodology for those boosted extra AO3. So what can you pick apart from it? So pause this, do that now, and then we'll come back. And then this is, this is the study here. So I'll talk through it because it can be quite a difficult bit of research to understand, but it comes up a couple of times in year 13 as well. So we need to make sure we know it inside out. So it's looking at the link between this idea of affectionless psychopathy and maternal deprivation. So we've got 44 teenagers accused of stealing. All of the thieves were interviewed for signs of affectionless psychopathy. So how he characterised it were a lack of affection, a lack of guilt, and a lack of empathy for victims. This is an interesting one. He also interviewed their families to try and establish whether they had prolonged early separation from their mother. And there was a control group of non-criminal but emotionally disturbed young people to see how often separation deprivation occurred in those who were not thieves. Okay, so a positive is that we have a control group, so we're trying to make it a little bit more scientific, but we've got some negatives we need to pick out as well. So he found that only 14 of the 44 could be described as affectionless psychopaths. Of that 14, 12 of them had experienced this prolonged separation from mums up to 2 years of their lives, whereas only 5 of the remaining 30 thieves had experienced separations. Of the control group, only 2 of them experienced long separations, which he concluded prolonged early separation caused affectionless psychopathy. Lots and lots to dig out of that. So the type of experiment. It's a natural experiment. If you're not sure what that is, go away and do a bit of research on that. It's a natural experiment. He's gone in, he's identified what the independent variable is, which is maternal separation deprivation. He's got his participants ready, so there's no random allocation at all. So that makes it quite difficult scientifically because we've already hand-picked who we're going to be using. So it's a natural experiment, which is quite comes with downfalls, like I've just said, random allocation as well. The criteria for affectionless psychopaths, how are we going to measure lack of empathy? How are we going to measure lack of affection and guilt? So they're interesting concepts, but they're really difficult to pinpoint and measure effectively, which is an issue. And then with the experiment, so if I was to pick some stuff out, I would say, right, 44, that's quite a low number. The samples are pretty small. 50 and above is seen to be a significant sample. The fact that they were interviewed strikes a massive problem for me because we're going to have them potentially lying, some social desirability bias, some demand characteristics. Maybe they're not going to want to be seen as having a lack of affection or a lack of guilt. Again, they're interviewing their families. Are they not going to lie? Yeah, I left my son for 3 or 4 years, got taken into care or whatever. There might be a barrier instantly put up because they don't want to be viewed as being a terrible parent. Yes, the control group is good because it shows some comparisons, but the findings are incredibly weak. Only 14 out of 44 can be described as this floaty, affectionless psychopath. And then of this, 12 of them have prolonged separation. So 12 out of 44. It's not amazing, it's not great. There's not really much we can conclude from it, would be our main problem. What else can I pick out? A really long time ago, the 44 thieves. Have I got a date for that? Oh, it was 1944. That's quite handy. 1944, 44 thieves. So a very long time ago. Has it still got temporal validity? Well, no, because affectionless psychopathy has completely changed as a diagnosis. Oh, what is it? You're going to have to Google it because it's going to bug me. It's changed into something else. So the criteria is completely different now, which means that the findings are kind of redundant. I think this is pretty much everything I've said. So they're asking them to recall separations. So they're asking them to talk about something retrospectively, which is going to change. Memory alters all the time. So there's not really going to be that reliable. Social desirability bias, like we said. Bowlby, kind of like Zimbardo, was conducting the experiment. He designed it. So we've got quite a bit of experimental bias here. He's responsible for choosing the sample. He is making up what affectionless psychopathy is. So we have quite a bit of heavy experimental bias there. Oh, that was the other thing, correlational data. So we're saying that maternal deprivation causes affectionless psychopathy. How can we say that? There's always going to be a third variable or something else that's involved. So there's only a relationship. One doesn't cause the other. It could be things like diet, parental income, education that could have affected the behaviour, not just this early separation. Oh, this is it. Reactive attachment disorder. When a child does not establish healthy attachment, has been recognised since 1980. Now, this is what it has been called, reactive attachment disorder. So it's more associated with criminality and violence. So it's changed what affectionless psychopathy is. Right, evaluation then. So we've evaluated the study, but we have to be careful. When you're evaluating a study, you've got to make sure you're linking it back to what the question is asking. Don't get caught up in this trap of just talking about the research. So a kind of question you could be asked, describe and evaluate the maternal deprivation hypothesis. So what you could say, once you've analysed 44 Thieves, you need to be linking it back to, well, actually, is it a good bit of research to support maternal deprivation? Well, he would argue yes, but we've got a lot of factors and faults with it. So you can either stop this now and peel paragraph yourself. Don't just copy out each of those paragraphs, turn it into a peel, because what these don't have is a really good link. And your link is really important to hint and show the examiner, look, I'm referencing the question in every single paragraph. I have a coherent argument. So turn them into peeled paragraphs. 3, if you're looking for like a CB, I'd be saying 4 for a good AA star with however sentences. You've got to really push yourself to show off for an AA star. So do that now, and then I've got them here that we can talk through. So the evidence is poor. Let's face it. We can use 44 Thieves to back it up, but actually once you pick it apart, it's really weak. A lot of different sources he drew upon for his hypothesis. So looking at orphan children from World War II, looking at those in institutions and poor quality orphanages. So really, it's very flawed, because if you look at war orphans, they're going to be traumatised. They probably didn't have really good aftercare, which is going to develop those difficulties later on. And like we've said, the 44 Thieves study, loads of flaws, absolute loads of bias, and methodologically it's quite weak too. Counter evidence is quite important. So not all of the research supports Bowlby's findings. Lewis came along, okay, 54, still not great, still quite a long time ago. Partially replicated, so took elements of the 44 Thieves study on a much bigger scale, so 500 young people. In her study, they had a prolonged separation from the mother, but this didn't predict criminality or difficulty forming relationships at all. There was lots of other factors included. So criminality, as you'll find out, is multifaceted. There's loads of different explanations as to why somebody commits crime. And I think maternal deprivation or prolonged deprivation is just one sort of drop in the ocean. So there's going to be lots of other factors that affect the outcome of maternal deprivation. Like we've said already, this critical period is actually a sensitive period. So later research has looked at the fact that the damage is not inevitable. It comes down to good aftercare and social interaction. So on the next slide, I've got a bit of research for you to go away and have a look at. but it is on page 89. Kolachova, a Czechoslovakian study, reported twin boys isolated from the age of 18 months, and they were kept in a cupboard by their stepmom until they were 7 years old. Ridiculous. Another one to go and look at is Genie as well. That's privation. That's a little bit different, but such an interesting bit of research. Kept locked in a cupboard, they were looked after by 2 loving adults and recovered fully. So there's a lot of research that fostering is really important, because given that connection, that loving household and attention can really reverse a lot of issues. So actually, this critical period is sensitive. It's not necessarily this has to happen in order for development to take place healthily. So this is the Kolachova twins. Have a little look at this and watch it, and then think about some of these questions there. And then for your AA star, your evaluation extra, one of those has to be included, I would say. So we've got some animal studies there. Obviously, we've got an issue with generalisation, but separating baby rats as little as a day had a massive effect on social development. So maybe it's the type of development that's affected when it comes to separation. Maybe intellectual development is fine, but socially could be a bit of an issue. Then deprivation and privation, what is the difference? So Rutter, who is quite a prominent attachment researcher, which we'll look at next lesson, claimed that when Bowlby was talking about deprivation, he was actually muddling 2 concepts. So deprivation is a loss of a primary attachment figure after they've developed an attachment, whereas privation is there's absolutely no attachment taking place at all. Okay, so these 2 are often mixed up, and he argued that Bowlby really did confuse these. So he's claimed that severe long-term damage that Bowlby associated with deprivation could actually be privation. So internal validity for his hypothesis is potentially quite weak. Quick question for you to have a go at them. 1 criticism of Bowlby's theory, that's all AO3, 3 marks. That's just turning those pill paragraphs into a good 3-4 sentence answer. And you can talk about any of these like we have spoke about before. This is an interesting one, economic implications. So like we said, people who are putting their child into nursery, women going to work, that's all something you can talk about here. Bit of real life application as well, which they love. Okay, and that is Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. So you can take away 5 things that you thought were really important from this lesson. What are you going to take away? What do you maybe need to have a go and look over? And then have a look at completing maybe the methods question there on the natural experiment, and maybe the AO2 for a bit of practice as well.